Alrighty, so welcome back everybody. So I last uploaded a video of me reacting to some conservative media, and it was interesting. But I figured, what if we talked about something that was a bit more on the other side of the spectrum? A controversial topic that's huge in today's discussion. And so there's a really good video here. It's by Dr. Yoon. I'd strongly recommend checking out his channel. But he has some really, really good insights onto the actuality of the trans situation. And it's really informative, especially if you just don't understand it or you think it's this atrocity that's been forced onto our society by a bunch of crazy leftists. This kind of just looks at the data. There's not a ton of intuition pumping. I mean, it goes into the studies, it goes into what a humanitarian approach is, it's about healthcare. And so why don't we watch it and just find out. So
there has been a huge backlash against the transgender community, and specifically transgender social media star Dylan Mulvaney after they got a brand deal from Bud Light.
A beer is now promoting itself during March Madness, a male-oriented event, by hiring a man who says he is a woman dressed as Audrey Hepburn to sell you beer.
Whether you're liberal or conservative, you probably have some strong feelings about this. So in this video, I'm going to share with you what medical studies say about gender affirmation and transgender people, and how I, as a real doctor, a board-certified plastic surgeon, believe this whole situation with transgender children and adults should be handled. Well, this is a super hot topic, and I know people have very strong opinions about transgender topics today. And so I'm going to try to handle it from a completely medical perspective. We're going to hear what the medical associations recommend, and we're going to talk about the studies that have actually looked at transgender surgery and transgender people in general. And in the end, I'm going to go on a limb and give you my opinion of this whole thing.
oh boy.
Did you know that only 0.7% of the population is transgender?
It's tiny.
Well, this is a relatively tiny segment of the overall population of the United States, yet it seems like this subject is in the news every single day. Well, studies show that transgender people realize that they are transgender at an average age of only 8.5 years old. However, they don't disclose their feelings until about 10 years later on average. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important for us to define two very important terms: cisgender and natal gender. I think we all know what transgender means, but do you know what cisgender and natal gender means? Because I think it's important to this whole discussion. The term cisgender refers to people who identify as the gender of their birth. Natal gender refers to the sex that was assigned at birth. So, I was born a male.
There you go. We have different definitions for each one. Surprise.
I identify as a male, so I'm a cisgendered male because I identify as that, and my natal gender is male. Well, something that is really concerning to me is that studies show that adolescents and adults who identify as transgender have high rates of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm, and suicide. In fact, one study found 56% of youth who identify as transgender have contemplated suicide, with 31% actually attempting suicide. Now,
all right, whether or not you agree with perhaps their political movement or whatever, I mean, if you think about it fundamentally, without getting into all the ideologies, you have real people who are feeling this way around 8, basically. And they are experiencing eating disorders, self-harm, suicide, stress, anxiety, bullying, and it's a lot of people. And I mean, I think if you just look at them as people, you're like, okay, I wouldn't want anybody to go through that who's a decent, honest, normal human being. But anyway.
Now this is compared to cisgendered, which is 20% and 11% comparatively. So think about it. 1 out of every 3 transgender youth have attempted suicide, and over half have considered it.
It's sad.
I mean, these are staggering and really, really sad numbers. Now, as the parent of 2 high school-aged children, for me to think that either of them would contemplate suicide is absolutely frightening. And I think that we can all agree that we do not want our youth, whether they're cisgender or transgender, to be in that situation and to be so down and to have such, I guess, lack of hope that they would actually consider this type of thing. Now, some people may say that transgender people have more mental illness. Therefore, they may be more likely to contemplate suicide. So is this true? Is there evidence that transgender people have more underlying mental illness than cisgendered people? Well, let's see what the experts say. According to the American Psychiatric Association, being transgender or gender variant implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social or vocational capabilities. However, these individuals often experience discrimination due to a lack of civil rights protections for their gender identity or expression. Such discrimination and lack of equal civil rights is damaging to the mental health of transgender and gender variant individuals. So, mental health issues among transgender people are more the effect of multiple factors, including discrimination, instead of an underlying difference in the amount of mental illness compared to the cisgendered community. And
that is a huge distinction. Like, these people are not unable to function in a lot of capacities because of innate measures. A lot of it has to do with how they're treated, which is how everybody ever reacts to environmental stimuli. So this is non-disputable in any capacity.
This, I think, is super important to realize. So is it just the psychiatrists that believe this? Well, let's see what the American Academy of Pediatrics states. They state that if a mental health issue exists, it most often stems from stigma and negative experiences rather than being intrinsic to the child. So transgender people aren't born with more mental illness, and mental illness does not cause them to be transgender. Transgender people who suffer from mental health issues often have it due to the way they are treated in our society. Now, on top of this, youth who identify as transgender experience disproportionately high rates of homelessness, physical violence, both violence at home and violence in the community, substance abuse, and high-risk sexual behaviors. So when you take all of this into account, I think you get the picture that transgender people are facing. It's discrimination, it's ridicule, bullying, and all of that leading to a poor sense of self-worth and
like, if you were to take a normal straight person and then or a normal cis person and then a normal trans person, and you were to bully them ineffectively due to some intrinsic characteristic within themselves, do you think any of them would function better? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Now, I get most people would be like, oh, I'm not for bullying, I would never do something like that, but I just refuse to call a man a woman when they're a man. And with that, I'll shut up, because he does get to that in this video, and he'll probably do a nicer job saying it than I will. So,
even mental illness that is not, I repeat, it is not a function of them being transgender. It's the result of society's lack of empathy and care for them as individuals. And studies show that this starts at home. In fact, one study looked at 433 transgender adolescents in Ontario, and they found that the suicide attempt rate was 4% when having supportive parents, and as high as 60% when parents weren't supportive.
It's great that there's a study here, but everybody knows that parents have a huge impact on how their kids end up. And so, you can, if when I was conservative, I would have probably just knocked the study and said, oh, I mean, these studies are recent, there's not enough data, or I would have said, oh, I don't trust it. The academia is dishonest and corrupt and brainwashes people. But I mean, that should just be common sense. If you get treated like shit from your parents because you have something that you can't really help, or something that's deeply intrinsic to who you are, what do you think's gonna happen? It's not rocket science.
We must do better than that.
Yes.
So how should we treat children who are possibly transgender? Well, research shows that children who are prepubertal, meaning ages 5 to about 12, and they identify as transgender, they know their gender as clearly as their peers who identify as cisgender, and they benefit from the same level of social acceptance. Now, this means that these children didn't come across as confused about their gender identity, but as certain in their gender as cisgendered children. So just as, let's say, a cisgendered boy naturally identifies as a boy, a transgender boy naturally identifies as a boy. So now let's shift gears and let's talk about the actual process of transitioning. I really would like to demystify something that this whole process, I think, for a lot of people is a mystery for them, and they think a lot of bad things about it. And so let's get to the nitty-gritty of exactly what it is. Gender affirmation refers to the process of reflection, acceptance, and for some, intervention. Basically, the idea is to accept the person for who they are. So, what is the typical course for a young person who...
Whoa, that's wild, really? It's wild. It's almost like the purpose of healthcare is to get people to function better and live the lives that they want to live. But yeah, that's wild. I never thought about that in my life.
who seeks gender affirmative care? Well, first it starts with social affirmation. Now, this includes adopting gender-affirming hairstyles and clothing. They also start using gender-affirming name and accurate pronouns.
And this is why when you get to the "what is a woman" question from good old Matt Walsh, it's kind of like, oh, using gender-affirming pronouns and gender-affirming clothing helps these people feel more at home in their body and who they are. It's like when you hear the turn of phrase like people searching for themselves or not being able to find themselves. Like there's a lot of people who struggle with finding out who they are. I mean, some people just get it instantly, but a lot of people it takes them a long time. And when you're searching for yourself and you can't find out who you are, and you keep searching and searching and searching and searching, it's just rough. It's so rough. And it's often hard for you to exceed in other areas such as education, career, hobbies, just whatever, social groups, because you don't know who you are. And it causes a lot of intrinsic pain and self-doubt, and it's rough. And I mean, it's driven, as you saw earlier, it's driven a lot of people to suicide. So, yeah, just food for thought.
And they begin using non-binary restrooms or gender-identifying restrooms. So the first part of this really is just lifestyle-based. Now the next step is puberty blockers, and I know that this is a bit of a controversial subject.
It is.
So let's explain what this is. Gonadotropin-releasing hormones have been used since the 1980s to prevent puberty in children who have central precocious puberty. Basically, by giving these hormones, you can slow down that pubertal process and prevent it from happening. Now, they can be used in adolescence until the age of 16 to give the child and the parents and the healthcare professionals time to explore their gender identity, to develop coping skills, and to give mental health support and really overall support the family and, of course, define the goals of their treatment. Now, if these puberty blockers are halted, then they progress naturally into puberty. Well, studies show that providing puberty blockers to adolescents who identify as transgender generally leads to improved psychological functioning in the young adulthood. And really the goal is to prevent their natal gender physical pubertal changes from happening. So if somebody is a transgender girl and they're starting to go through puberty, we don't want, let's say, the Adam's apple to enlarge, we don't want the facial changes to occur to make this transgender girl to develop more as a boy or a man. And this is because these can necessitate surgery to reverse, and obviously as a surgeon we know we don't want to perform surgery that we don't have to. Now the next step is cross-sex hormone therapy, and this starts in early adolescence. So testosterone is given for female to male transgender patients, and estrogen plus androgen inhibitors are given for male to female transgender patients. And these medications give the transgender person the physical characteristics of their true gender identity. So if somebody is going from male to female, being on estrogen plus androgen inhibitor hormones would, let's say, give the person a higher voice, maybe softer features, and other traditionally female characteristics. For female to male, testosterone will make the voice deeper, it will give more facial hair, and give the figure more like a traditional male figure. Now, the last step in transitioning is gender-affirming surgeries.
Which, if you think about it, like let's say there's a trans person and they like sports, and the whole goal of this is to make these people feel more at home in who they are so that they can function in society and thus contribute to societal success. Just like everybody, we want everybody who's here to do that to contribute to the country's success. So with that said, when you say things like, oh, we need to wait till they're 18 before letting them decide on that surgery, that's the age they need to be to conclude that. Like, you're effectively putting them past the age where their body is going to have a potential to change to look more like the gender they prefer. And when that happens, you run into situations where it's a little bit harder for this person to maybe compete in a sport, or they have certain competitive advantages that weren't always going to be there. But if you can kind of hit this earlier, a lot of that will happen. So anyway.
Now, the data is very clear that undergoing gender-affirming procedures, including surgery, is very beneficial for people with gender dysphoria. Now, there was a survey of over 22,000 transgender people, and they found that gender-affirming surgeries were associated with a 42% reduction in psychological distress and a 44% reduction in suicidal ideation when compared with transgender and gender-diverse people who had not had gender-affirming surgery, but they wanted it. But not all transgender people get surgery. In fact, the opposite is actually true. Approximately 1 in 4 transgender people undergo surgery. So 3 in 4 do not undergo surgery.
Yeah.
So what are the types of procedures that are performed? Well, there are a lot. And although the less invasive procedures, like injectable fillers and Botox, can be done by a plethora of trained practitioners, the actual operations should in general be performed by a real plastic surgeon who specializes in these procedures. So for example, if you're transitioning from male to female and you're considering breast augmentation, you don't want to go to any old plastic surgeon to perform this surgery, because it usually must be done differently than a standard breast augmentation in a cisgendered female. So for example, the male nipple typically lies in a different place, usually a little bit lower than the female nipple, and this should be realized during the operation. Now, gender-affirming operations are separated into 3 basic categories. There's facial reconstructive surgery, top surgery, and bottom surgery. Top surgery and facial reconstruction surgery are usually performed first. Now, I get a lot of people who call my office for gender affirmation surgery, and I'll tell you, this is not something that I actually perform actively. And this is because I strongly believe that these operations are so specialized that only specialists should perform them. And I am not a gender affirmation surgery specialist. So when people call my office for these types of operations, I will usually refer them to specialists across the country who I trust. That being said, we do injections in my office because I do think that these are not quite as complex and can be performed by a lot of different experts in the field. Now, what about gender affirmation surgery regret? There are people who believe that a high percentage of transgender people who undergo gender affirmation surgery regret it later. Well, the truth is, a recent study revealed only a 1% incidence of surgery regret after gender affirmation surgery. Just 1%. So the belief that a high percentage of transgender people...
And that's the thing, like, I get it happens, but I mean, when people drive cars too, there are going to be some people who get in accidents. You want to look at the overall data to conclude whether or not this thing is helpful. Like, for the most part, it might be that, like, Zoloft, for example, is helpful to 90% of people, or 95% of people. But maybe there's that 5 or 10% that don't do as well with it. Should we just throw it out and never do it? But I think this also speaks to the notion of the efficacy of healthcare and like what the purpose of healthcare is. So the intended result of healthcare should be to help people function at a normal capacity, in the sense in which they can get an education, learn things, form relationships, live a full life. If your solution is something like gay conversion therapy or just like gender disapproval, and it doesn't have a good effect on the targeted population, then you are not contributing to making the world a better place. You're not contributing to helping these people. You're actually hurting them. And that's why we need to be very careful about our policy positions. Like Tennessee has some really fucked up gender policies. So anyway.
People who undergo gender affirmation procedures regret them later, that is just not true.
Yeah.
So what do I believe about gender-affirming care, and specifically Dylan Mulvaney? Well, life is not easy for people who are LGBTQ. For hundreds of years, they've been discriminated against, they've been bullied, harassed, ridiculed, and pushed to believe that something is inherently wrong with them.
And yeah, this has been for hundreds of years. I mean, I think the first scientist, or the first scholar who was looking into this was Magnus Hirschfeld, I want to say is his last name. But that was like right before Hitler came into power. When he came into power, he was burning books and messing up with this, or messing up the whole academic situation with transgender people. But this has likely been going on for a while. I mean, even if you look at like ancient gods, the most popular one being Hermaphroditus, there was definitely characters with male and female characteristics. And given that its mythology, it likely stemmed from some actualized phenomenon, and thus it's likely been going on since there's a ton of references to it in history. But anyway, I digress.
This type of bullying and hateful behavior is so incredibly harmful, and it results in high rates of suicide, depression, and overall unhappiness. What are we doing? Well, whenever possible, we should first and foremost love each other, no matter the color of our skin, our socioeconomic status, or the gender we believe we really are. Now, if you find Dylan Mulvaney weird or annoying or an opportunist, then just don't follow her. Don't let her transition affect you then, and please focus on being nice to our fellow human beings. Now, I know I'm probably going to lose a lot of followers for saying that, but that's okay. Life is short, my friends. Let's not spend it being mean to each other, but instead practice kindness and empathy. Now, you know, I recently reacted to a video of a young transgender man undergoing top surgery, and I think his story is very eye-opening. In the video, you follow him through his process and see his final results. Please check it out right up here where I react.
Anyway, so he's got some. I'd recommend you check out his YouTube channel. It's Dr. Yoon, 4.74 million subscribers. Also, he's got sources here, references. So please, like, check them out, read them. It's good stuff. But yeah, I figured we would react to this since last time we did a more conservative video, and what it comes down to is if you're not going to argue with me about science and evidence and facts and use logic, I mean, I'm just not going to have a conversation with you. Like, if you're just going to reassert your opinion over and over again and expect me to just listen to you, like, that's not going to happen. And I'm not going to give you any of my time if that happens. So, anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you. Bye.